So why is it a branching out rather than a linear progression? Darwin puzzles over this for years. And his explanation for the increasing diversity of life, what he later calls the principle of divergence, is not very well known outside a circle of historians and philosophers of evolutionary theory, and this is a group that includes some real Darwin obsessives. Perhaps surprisingly, the roots of this principle are aesthetic, landscapes of disorder and entanglement. And Darwin also links it with industry and agriculture, the division and management of land and labor. So some of my points will follow, I think, nicely from Patricia's talk on the productive landscape. If we look first at aesthetics, there's a discourse of diversity that emerges in the 18th and early 19th century travel literature and writing on the beautiful and the picturesque. Landscapes are admired for their varied elevations, their flora and fauna, their pleasing contrasts of light and dark. The Lake District, the Alps, and increasingly the tropics. Intersecting with this discourse and intention with it is an aesthetic of the sublime, with its emphasis on the grandeur, abundance, and power of nature, scenes in which the observer is threatened or overwhelmed, reason and language stymied. By the time of Darwin's voyage, this is a well-established tradition. It structures the experience of travelers, tropical forests, deep ravines, rugged mountains, and violent weather, all carefully described so that European visitors will know where to go to be overwhelmed. And Darwin is steeped in this aesthetic tradition, or traditions really. They run through his Beagle Diary, his letters, the published narrative of the voyage. And his role model here was Alexander von Humboldt. He had been urged to read the Prussian naturalist while at Cambridge by his mentor, the botanist John Stevens Henslow. You'll be hearing a lot more about Henslow tomorrow. Before the prospect of the Beagle voyage arose, Darwin had planned a more modest expedition to the Canary Islands. And in preparation for the trip, he made regular visits to the hothouse in Cambridge Botanical Gardens to breathe in the tropical air. Returning to his room to absorb the pages of Humboldt's personal narrative. "My head is running about the tropics," he wrote to his sister. "My enthusiasm is so great that I cannot sit still on my chair." The invitation to voyage on the Beagle to South America, which was the main setting of Humboldt's travels, strengthened this connection. "I formerly admired Humboldt," Darwin wrote to Henslow. "I now almost adore him. He alone gives any sense of the feelings which are raised in the mind on first entering the tropics." Like many of Humboldt's readers, Darwin was captivated by descriptions of the rainforest, in which the naturalist was engulfed by vegetation, his passions aroused and his perception stymied. Darwin remarked on the gracefulness of tropical forms, the novel richness of their colors, their numberless and confusing associations that rush together in the mind. So this is an engraving of a work titled Une forêt vierge, Virgin Forest, in Brazil by Charles Clairac. And the original was exhibited in Paris in 1819, and it was bought by Humboldt, who apparently commented on its organic sense of detail in the totality of nature. Darwin had gazed at this engraving as he read his Humboldt so avidly before the voyage, and shaping his visual expectations, he refers back to it when he arrives on the scene. He writes, "As the gleams of sunshine penetrate the entangled mass, I was forcibly reminded of the French engraving after the drawing of Clairac. In these is well represented the infinite numbers of lianas and parasitical plants, and the contrast of the flourishing trees with the dead and rotten trunks. I was at an utter loss how sufficiently to admire the scene. So the play of contrasts between light and shadow, life and death, the intricate details, these are all features of the picturesque. But Darwin's overall impression is different. A sense not of beautiful variety, but of infinitude, overwhelming perception, imagination, and language, all hallmarks of the sublime. And at various junctures, the sublime disturbs the pleasing beauty of diversity. More genteel, proportioned assessments of nature open onto a space of wildness, profusion, and disorder within a still unified scene. Another such moment in the forest is characterized by the teeming of plant and insect life. Form upon form dance before his eyes so that he can't focus. He can't fix upon any object to observe in isolation. His mind, he says, is an utter chaos of delight. So the integrity of such scenes lies in their overwhelming diversity, experienced at the level of emotion, and described as a thickly interwoven fabric of life and entanglement. These experiences and the repertoire of picturesque and sublime aesthetics that structure them are recorded, taken home, reflected upon, and they inform Darwin's later efforts to depict the spatial and temporal relations of life. The motif of entanglement will return in the famous closing passage of Origin of Species, but there are some glimpses of it elsewhere. Building on the early notebook sketch, Darwin produced other branching diagrams considerably later. These are done in the mid-1850s. These are much more detailed. They chart the development of specific animal groups. We have rodents and marsupials. We have the parents of marsupials. Let dots represent genera? Question mark, question mark. If these had all given descendants, then there would have been a great series. That's the scrawl on the bottom she's writing. But many of them don't. Many of them don't survive. The proliferation of new forms is conjoined with extinction, as in the jungle, flourishing trees and dead and rotten trunks in a dense configuration. Perhaps what is most striking is this vibrant irregularity and cragginess. In some sketches, the lines seem to come right out of the page. And this departs from most schemes of classification in the period, tabular or geometric, the groups discretely divided, evenly spaced. And it's not just that Darwin is sloppy, a bad artist. He enlarges this scheme and refines it, passing through several drafts. He tries to preserve the irregularity, though he has to compromise. He pleads with his publisher and his printer, and then he underscores this in the final text. I do not suppose that the process ever goes on so regularly as is represented, though the diagram is made somewhat irregular. So in the famous folding diagram in Origin of Species, the root-like structure is inverted into a tree, more visually pleasing and familiar to Darwin's readers who will be acquainted with family trees and genealogies of animal breeding. This period of sketching in the 1850s was filled with reflections on divergence as a complementary principle to natural selection, explaining why the history of taxonomy takes the shape of a tree, a branching tree. Darwin counts the number of species within genera, of varieties within species. The numbers confirm that larger genera have more species per genus, more varieties per species. They are wide-ranging geographically, dense and teeming with life, ascendant. Others are in decline, thinning, branches that will grow barren and eventually fall. This diagram is obviously temporal, but it's also spatial. Divergence leads to encroachment on neighboring species. Competition, Darwin writes, is most severe among allied forms which fill nearly the same space. So one line ends where another spreads across it, filling its space in the polity of nature. One critic described the diagram as an open fan. There's a favorite Whistler motif. But here most of the sticks are broken off. Little secondary fans branch out. Millions of developing forms are constantly aiming to push out their divergent lines of offspring over the same ground. And wherever they cross each other, a battle for life ensues in which the stronger or better adapted to the locality triumphs. Okay. So let's turn to the other sources for Darwin's Principle of Divergence, agronomy and industry. From the middle 1850s, Darwin experiments with plots of ground, scaling up and down in size from a 13-acre field adjacent to his sandwalk to an orchard plot, a lawn plot, and finally a square yard of turf. That's there to this day in Downhouse in Kent. You can see this. And I should say here that his house, just 10 miles from London, was a rural retreat from the urban bustle, but it was also a place of continuous work, of intense observation and experiment, not only in his private study, but in the garden, the greenhouses, the fields, and the neighboring countryside. He counts all the species in these plots. He leaves the areas undisturbed and exposed to the same conditions for many years. In this little patch, he eventually finds 20 species of plants from 18 different genera, from 8 different orders. Remarkable diversity. The patch of weeds is an entangled bank in the making. Given the right scale and conditions, even a tropical rainforest. These experiments help build an interactive model of species change in which other organisms make up the most important part of the environment, always varying, always competing. The little plot is able to support more life if organisms have divergent structures and habits, feeding on different things at different times, at varying depths. And Darwin links his own plot studies with large-scale experiments by George Sinclair, the gardener to the Duke of Bedford, on different soils. He's also familiar with the work of John Gilbert at Rothamsted Station in Hertfordshire, and this is a page from Gilbert's work with different soil and grain samples starting in 1843 and running continuously for 50 years. So here is Georgian estate management and British agricultural improvement at its finest. The isolation of different manures, fallow pastures, patterns of rotation, complementary species, and the yield precisely measured by weight. The words that run across the bottom of the page on the left are an epigraph of Sinclair's experimental horticulture taken from another agricultural chemist, Humphrey Davy. They read, "The science of the soil must increase our wealth, our population, and our physical strength, multiplying life and providing for its enjoyment." Darwin notes that farmers can raise more food by rotation of plants of different orders. So nature follows a simultaneous rotation, this is his words, raising her crops in proportion to what the soil can support, each kind changing its place, though caring not which plants overmaster. So even without the hand of man, nature is an improver, well versed in the science of the soil. The last analogy Darwin draws is industrial, the division of labor. In Origin of Species, he refers to the work of a French zoologist, Henri Milne Edwards, who draws explicitly on Adam Smith to interpret the hierarchical order of animals. The division of labor occasions in every art a proportional increase of the productive powers. The separation of trades is carried further in those countries which enjoy the highest degree of industry. This from the Encyclopedia of 1762, Adam Smith's famous example of the division of labor. I'm sure you were all looking forward to seeing a pin factory at an event on Whistler. Darwin describes how the division of labor operates across nature, structuring organization inside organic bodies and arranging forms in the landscape. The advantage of diversification in the inhabitants of the same region, he says, is in fact the same as that of the division of labor in the organs of our body. So the body, Darwin suggests, is like a factory. It gains in power and efficiency with the number of workers performing different tasks: chewing, swallowing, dissolving, extracting, secreting. The same principle is applied to the land. It is more productive, more life-supporting if creatures that live on it complement and support each other rather than competing directly for the same resources. And you can see Darwin applying the division of labor in mid-sentence in this fragment of a draft. This is real archival history. You can't actually, because it's very hard to read. But division of labor, I'll just read some of it for you. The advantage in each group becoming as different as possible might be compared to the fact that by division of labor, most people can be supported in each capacity. Not only do individuals of each group struggle against one another, but each group itself struggles against other groups. This is a very complicated and controversial bit of evolutionary theory, but the suggestion is that organisms in a given environment are like industrial workers. Groups of organisms are like factories. Diversity enables more life, and diverse communities, that is, divergent organisms working together like a single body. They are stronger, fitter, and more adaptable, more advanced than their more samey counterparts, and they will outcompete them. Like the well-managed fields and factories of improving Britain. Darwin often uses expressions like economy of nature, polity of nature. These are terms that run through the discourses of natural history and political economy from the 18th to the early 19th century. And these economies are all characterized by equilibrium, balance of forces, extinction and creation. There's a fixed quantity of life, there are fixed limits of species, and into this system of harmony and balance, Darwin injects profuse and disorderly growth. Wildness conceived not as a place, but as a power and principle, operative everywhere. Now, is this the sublime that so captivated Darwin on the beagle and in some of his early speculations on species? Skip that one. Oh, I lost one. Oh, I've got the wrong PowerPoint presentation. Damn. Can we find... Sorry. For some reason, there were two copies of it. And if I go and this is mine. That's the one. Okay, that's the wrong one. Try that one. I'll just set the three on that page. Sorry about this. There. Okay. So the question is the sublime the same as the one that captivated him on the beagle? The sublime of the entangled bank, is it the same as the rainforest? Well, as Darwin moves from his early experiences as a traveler to his quiet rural retreat, observing and experimenting with the landscape of the South Downs, the wild sublimity of nature is overlain with analogies of agricultural improvement and the division of labor. And these intensely managerial processes, animal husbandry, agronomy, industrial manufacture, they follow one after another in Darwin's explication of divergence. And they are woven together to produce the closing passage in Origin of Species. There's still entanglement, but the luxuriance, the overwhelming power is subtler. It's quieter and slower to make itself felt and known. In the closing metaphor of the entangled bank, there's birdsong in the air, there are insects flitting about, there are worms burrowing underground, forms so different and yet so dependent on each other. Humans are present, but only as observers, to reflect and contemplate. That's how the passage begins. Contemplate. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank. So all of these elements that make up the Darwinian landscape have been carefully observed over many years, isolated and manipulated. In the garden, the study, the laboratory, the flight paths of bees. He watches them, he observes them, he draws maps. The floral structures that entice the bees, the different forms of flowering plants and their comparative fertility, tendrils that bend toward the light and turn slowly to clasp a support, bearing the stems to new heights, the mating behavior of birds, their songs and dances, even the silent work of worms beneath, natural tillers of the earth. What is sublime only becomes visible slowly by an accumulation of observations and experiments over long periods of time. The objects of the scene can be recomposed, their interconnections, their spatial and temporal relations unfolding beautifully and wonderfully. Now, Darwin's last landscape, even tinier than the square yard of turf. They include these tower-like structures, looming 2 to 5 inches in height. Vertical plots extending down in space and time. These are wormscapes. The sample here was taken from a field plowed in 1822 and on fallow ever since. Burnt marl and coal cinders had been raised to the surface by the plow and then gradually covered over by layers of vegetable matter, raised by worms year upon year at a rate of 0.19 of an inch. And the towers are castings from one night's worm activity, monuments of their labor, washed away by the first rain, or trampled upon, unnoticed. Darwin was fascinated by this slow, silent work, below the surface of the earth, but vital to its fertility. He observes various worm sites at intervals for over 40 years, starting in 1837, only a year after the Beagle voyage, before he drew his first tree of life. In the finished study, his last book, he describes how worms ready the ground for farmers, allowing seedlings to better root and grow, like the gardener who prepares fine soil for choice plants. Worms bury inorganic matter. They process the dead, leaves, twigs, shells of beetles, bodies of insects, even bones of animals, converting it all into fine food for plants, while covering the surface with a rich humus. The whole surface of the arable earth has passed through the bodies of these tiny creatures. It may be doubted, he says, whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world. I said at the start that it was a challenge to think about Darwin in relation to Whistler. That's not the right one either. Well, we'll leave that one. As historians, at least for me, I always look for evidence of connections, lines of sight, not necessarily direct, but somewhere. Notebooks, diaries, letters, biographies, social networks, the response of contemporary critics, readers, patrons, shared materials and methods. Finding none of this, I can only say that in writing this talk, I've been guided by some of Whistler's landscapes, especially the nocturnes, including the one that got him into so much trouble. Looking at Darwin in light of Whistler, rather than the other way around, there may be affinities of engagement with nature of a particular kind, ways of seeing, discovering, and depicting a beauty that is so quiet or atmospheric that emerges slowly through patient study when no one else is looking, or after everyone else has gone home. A respect and a preference for this quieter beauty, delicate figures and lines, ephemeral features, tranquil moments that are almost miniatures, but become expansive, away from the forest of gigantic forms, or the tangled masts and rigging, the crisscross lines of transit in a busy port, so overwhelming to the senses. No palm trees, and no silly sunsets. Thank you.